Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and the following 60 minutes or so is an excerpt from the One Step Beyond show from August 18th, 1996. The basic focus is the intelligence community, the national security establishment, not only of this country but other countries, and gene splicing and perhaps the deliberate spreading of genetically engineered biological warfare weapons. The first thing I'm going to read in connection with the possibility of actual genetically engineered microorganisms being used to infect people today is an article that appeared in the Townsend Letter for Doctors in Press, 1995. That's not a publication I know anything about. This is an article entitled Chronic Fatigue Illnesses Associated with Service in Operation Desert Storm, subtitled Were Biological Weapons Used Against Our Forces in the Gulf War? This is authored by Garth L. Nicholson, Nicolson, Ph.D., and Nancy L. Nicholson, Nicolson, Ph.D., researchers with the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, Texas, and the Rodin, R-H-O-D-O-N, Foundation for Biomedical Research in Kingwood, Texas, and their various other credits and honoraria that these two doctors have. The doctors stress in regard to Gulf War syndrome that there are in all probability many different causes, including exposure to native parasites and infective organisms, possible breathing of very fine sand particles, exposure to some of the petroleum smoke, the possibility that biological weapons may have either been launched, biological munitions launched against our forces in the Persian Gulf War, or the possibility that chemical and or biological weapons may have been used to may have infected our forces accidentally when they were destroyed during the course of the combat. Indeed, I wondered about that at the time. When you drop high explosive munitions on nuclear and chemical and biological warfare facilities, one would think that it would spread that stuff around. The authors have also come across in many of the service people that have been affected by GWS, Gulf War Syndrome, an infectious mycoplasma. That is a form of bacterium, a microorganism that can infect human beings and cause disease. However, the mycoplasmas that were detected by these researchers appear to have been genetically altered by somebody for some reason to make them more infectious. Again, this paper is entitled, let me get back to the title page here. Here we go. This is from the Townsend Letter for Doctors in Press, 1995. Chronic fatigue illnesses associated with service in Operation Desert Storm were biological weapons used against our forces in the Gulf War. And skipping well down into the article, after a discussion of the probability that multiple causes exist for Gulf War syndrome, we find, we read here, after listening to the health complaints of many veterans of Desert Shield and Storm, including our stepdaughter who served with the Army's 101st Airborne Division, Air Assault, in the deep insertions into Iraq, and their inability to convince military hospitals and VA medical centers that they are suffering from the same major symptoms listed in Figure 2, we suggested that most of these symptoms can be explained by aggressive, pathogenic mycoplasma infections. The variable incubation time of GWS, ranging from months to years after presumed exposure, the cyclic nature of the relapsing fevers, and other symptoms are consistent with a disease caused by biological agent or agents. We strongly suspected that mycoplasmas, a group of small microorganisms related to bacteria but without cell walls, some of which can invade cells, might be involved in some of the GWS. In general, this type of microorganism can cause chronic infections that yield unusual signs and symptoms. Usually, mycoplasma infections produce diseases limited to particular tissue sites or organs such as urinary tract or respiratory infections. However, the types of mycoplasmas that we have detected in Desert Storm veterans and that may be causing the chronic fatigue and other symptoms in GWS are very pathogenic, colonize a variety of organs and tissues, and are difficult to treat. Even pathogenic mycoplasmas that can invade cells and tissues, such as Mycoplasma fermentans, Fermentans, incognitus strain, or Mycoplasma penetrans, should be treatable with multiple courses of oral antibiotics such as doxycycline or ciprofloxacin. In the absence of sensitive and reliable clinical tests for invasive mycoplasmas, we suggested that physicians consider empirical treatment of GWS with antibiotics like doxycycline. In fact, of the 73 Desert Storm veterans that we followed who had most of the signs and symptoms listed in Figure 2 and were able to find treatment, 55 indicated that they had good responses with doxycycline and they eventually returned to normal duty. The invasive pathogenic mycoplasmas that are associated with service in Operation Desert Storm are not easily detected, but can be identified by a technique that we developed called gene tracking. In patients with GWS, gene tracking starts with the preparation of the nucleoprotein complex fractions from leukocyte nuclei of GWS patients' blood. By the way, much of this is Greek to me, not being medically and scientifically versed in this field. I'm simply presenting it for those who are. Once the blood leukocytes are obtained, their nuclei are prepared and exposed to a restriction enzyme, MSPL, that cuts DNA at specific sites to release specific nucleoprotein complexes. The nucleoprotein complexes are then separated by native, non-denaturing, low ionic strength gel electrophoresis in the absence of chelating agents and transferred onto a nitran paper support. Once they are immobilized on the nitran paper, they can then be probed using a radioisotope labeled, usually oligonucleotide, that will only bind to a specific DNA sequence. In the example shown in Figure 4, we have probed the nucleoprotein fractions obtained from the blood leukocytes of a GWS patient with a probe specific for Mycoplasma fermentans incognita strain. In Figure 4, a mycoplasma-specific gene that was found in nucleoprotein fraction M1 purified from the leukocyte nuclei of a GWS patient. This suggests that the mycoplasma has penetrated deep into the nucleus of the patient's blood cells. In our preliminary study on veterans with GWS, CFIDS, and their families, we have found evidence of mycoplasma infections in about 55% of the GWS patients' blood leukocytes. All of these GWS patients were very ill, so it is unlikely that approximately one-half of all veterans with GWS have mycoplasmal infections. In addition, not every Desert Storm veteran has the same type of mycoplasma gene sequences inside their leukocytes. So far, the majority of the mycoplasma gene sequences that have been identified in GWS patients' blood are from Mycoplasma fermentans incognita strain. As discussed above, pathogenic invasive mycoplasmas such as M. fermentans incognita strain or M. penetrans should be treatable with multiple courses of antibiotics such as doxycycline. Of the Desert Storm veterans who had most of the GWS CFIDS symptoms listed in Figure 2, most had good response with doxycycline and after multiple courses of antibiotics eventually recovered. And, skipping down, we consider it quite likely that many of the Gulf War veterans suffering from the GWS CFIDS symptoms may have been infected with microorganisms, quite possibly pathogenic invasive mycoplasms and other pathogens or bacteria, and such infections can produce the symptoms shown in Figure 2 long after exposure. This would also explain the apparently mildly contagious nature of GWS in some veterans and the appearance of similar GWS CFIDS symptoms in their immediate family members. In our preliminary study on a small number of Gulf War veterans and their families, we have found evidence of mycoplasmic infections in about one-half of the patient's blood that we have examined. Not every Gulf War veteran had the same type of mycoplasma DNA sequences inside their white blood cells. Of particular importance, however, was our detection, and this is the really important part of this article. Again, much of the rest of it is frankly Greek to me and not being versed in this field. Of particular importance, however, was our detection of highly unusual DNA sequences in the same nucleoprotein complex fractions by the same gene tracking technique. These highly unusual DNA sequences included a portion of a retrovirus genome, the HIV1ENV gene, but not all of the genes that make up the virus. Thus, these soldiers were not infected with the HIV virus, because the virus cannot replicate with only the gene that we detected. Interestingly, The specific DNA sequence that we detected encodes a protein that, if expressed on the surface of the mycoplasma, would enable the mycoplasma to bind to many cell types in the body and even enter those cells by an endocytonic mechanism similar to that used by the HIV virus. The presence of the viral envelope gene in the mycoplasma could be due to genetic manipulation or, much less likely, natural causes, but the importance of this event would be that a relatively benign mycoplasma could be converted to a much more invasive and pathogenic organism that is capable of attacking many organ and tissue systems. Such findings suggest that the mycoplasmas that we have found in Gulf War veterans are not naturally occurring organisms, or, to be more specific, they could have been genetically manipulated to be more invasive and pathogenic, potent biological weapons. Of course, the CFIDS-like symptoms can be the result of chemical exposures as well as chronic infections, and this would be consistent with our findings of pathogenic microorganisms in the blood of a fraction of soldiers who have GWS. In our sample of Gulf War veterans, the soldiers that were involved in the deep insertions into Iraq and those that were near Saudi and Kuwaiti Scud B impact sites, particularly those missiles that caused air bursts but not high explosive ground bursts, may be at highest risk for contracting the mycoplasma infections that we feel are a major culprit in GWS CFIDS. And again, that type of microorganism, a mycoplasma, appears to have one of the genes from the HIV virus in it, and the authors suggest very strongly that that particular mycoplasma may have been genetically engineered by a party or parties unknown, and then found its way into many of our service people, many of our troops in the Persian Gulf, whether as a result of the destruction of biological weapon stockpiles in Iraq, or whether as the result of Scud explosions or BW munitions that were used against our troops, or whatever. It certainly is intriguing, and again, I think qualified people should look into the research done by the Nicholsons to determine the possible origin of those genetically engineered, apparently genetically engineered mycoplasms containing parts of the HIV virus. Now, I have done in RFA 16 a long, by the way, RFA 16 was first put together in April of 1986, and in turn accessed or entailed research that I have been accessing on the air since 1984, that AIDS may very well be the result of biological engineering. Indeed, that hypothesis has since been taken up by a great many researchers, including some of those cited by R. Roy Blake. And again, the archive show RFA 16, AIDS, Epidemic or Weapon of War, goes into some of the documentation. There is a new book, and an extremely important book, and a lavishly documented book that fits right along the lines of inquiry that I had engaged in RFA 16. Again, a listener to this program suggested that I rename the program from One Step Beyond to I Told You So. And that should not be interpreted in any way as being arrogant, but rather one can determine reality from the nature of facts. And if one thinks with an open mind, I think there are an awful lot of things that become clear that would not otherwise become clear. I want to emphatically endorse and recommend a new book. I have not finished it yet, but I've read long sections of it. I'm going to be accessing excerpts of it on the air. I'm going to be interviewing the author on more than one occasion. This book is called Emerging Viruses. In fact, you heard about the you heard the reference to the phrase emerging viruses in that passage of Objective Evil by R. Roy Blake that I read. The book Emerging Viruses, subtitled AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional, is authored by Dr. Leonard G. Horowitz, Horowitz, with a foreword by Dr. John Martin, Martin. It's published in hardcover by Tetrahedron Incorporated. That's spelled Tetrahedron Incorporated. they can be contacted, and again, I would strongly encourage you to have your local retail book outlets pick up or stock this book. Tetrahedron Incorporated can be contacted at P.O. Box 402, Rockport, Massachusetts, 01966. Once again, Tetrahedron Incorporated, P.O. Box 402, Rockport, Massachusetts, 01966. There is also an 800 number that you can call, 800-336-9266. Once again, 800-336-9266. There is also an email for Tetrahedron, tetrahedron.org. Once again, that's tetra, T-E-T-R-A, at tetrahedron.org. There's also a web page, http://www.tetrahedron.org. Once again, that web page, http://www.tetrahedron.org. And again, this book is entitled Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional. It's a remarkable book which in many ways, I guess you could say, presents the smoking gene, one could say. It really fleshes out the working hypothesis that I had presented as far back as 1984 and included in RFA 16, that AIDS may very well be the result of genetic engineering and a man-made virus. This book goes into many of the things that I had discussed in RFA 16, including the National Cancer Institute's Viral Cancer Research Program, Lytton Bionetics, the National Cancer Institute's Molecular Oncology Laboratory located on the site of Fort Detrick, and develops the lines of inquiry that I had presented in RFA 16 at considerable length. It implicates the National Cancer Institute's VCRP, Lytton Bionetics, and a number of other institutions in the creation of AIDS, and also discusses Ebola as a deliberately created virus. Beyond that, it traces the origin of these apparently man-made viruses, whether accidentally discovered and then intentionally communicated, or whether accidentally discovered and accidentally transmitted. This book makes an excellent case, a formidable case that these viruses are not naturally occurring viruses. And beyond that, there is extensive discussion of the Galen Organization, the Project Paperclip scientists, and traces the genesis of many of the research programs that appear to have resulted in AIDS and Ebola to the importation of the Galen people and the Project Paperclip scientists. I'm going to begin by reading several pages of the conclusion that is presented here by Dr. Leonard Horowitz. In the conclusion, he, in a section entitled The Intentional AIDS Transmission Theory, discusses or writes as follows. And again, I'm going to be excerpting this book for many weeks to come. I'm going to be interviewing the author on numerous occasions. I can't emphasize this book too strongly. This is one of the most important books in a long, long time. In fact, I'd say this is the most important book I've discussed in the last 25 minutes. There are a lot of really important books coming out. Objective Evil, Blood Oath. This book is fantastically important, and in many ways, as Dr. Horowitz commented as he began to familiarize himself with my work, this book appears to fall right along the lines that I have been presenting not only in RFA 16 but other broadcasts as well. In The Intentional AIDS Transmission Theory, the author writes as follows. It has been theorized, and circumstantial evidence in this book supports the theory, that black Africans and American homosexuals may have been targeted for viral weapons experimentation by activists in America's military, medical, industrial complex, and agents for the CIA. According to the Church Commission hearings, Henry Kissinger, and by association, Elmo Zumwalt or Melvin Laird, and Sidney Gottlieb, by the way, Gottlieb was discussed in the Objective Evil passage, and Sidney Gottlieb ordered or administered the development and or stockpiling of biological weapons, including immune system destroying viruses functionally identical to HIV, and the deployment of systems necessary to administer these viruses to large populations. Frank Carlucci, Joseph Califano, and Alexander Haig may also have been involved. The principal military scientists and industrialists involved in the development, study, and or possible deployment of AIDS-like viruses, which may have included Ebola and Marburg-like rhabdoviruses, that's spelled R-H-A-B-D-O-V, then viruses, include Robert Gallo of the National Cancer Institute, John Landon and Robert Ting of Linton Bionetics, Linton Industries President Roy Ash, research affiliates of MSD, including Maurice Hilleman, and a handful of researchers at the New York University Medical Center, the New York City Blood Bank, the University of California, and the Center for Disease Control. Additional institutions which may have played a role in the development of such germs during the 1960s and early 1970s include the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, the Navy's Biomedical Research Laboratory, Hazleton Laboratories Incorporated, the NIAID, and the AEC. It is likely that most of the scientists involved in developing such viruses for military contractors, the NCI, the CIA, and the Special Operations Division of the Army, believed they were serving the interests of national security or humanity. The question of their supervisors' purposes, motivations, and intent can only be fully answered through a congressional inquiry. With regard to the theory of intentional AIDS transmission for population control, undoubtedly, the motives and mechanisms existed to support this possibility. The evidence shows a channel through which experimental mutant viruses, viral vaccines, other reagents, and drugs flowed between the NCI, that's the National Cancer Institute, and affiliated testing laboratories at Linton Bionetics and Fort Detrick to MSD and its related research labs in New York and Central Africa was the drug development branch of the NCI. By the way, MSD is the company that has supplied the vaccines to the United States Army and has been at the core of much of the BW research that has been conducted in this country. Continuing. Through this channel or another, the CIA or a saboteur may have delivered a single roller bottle. Beginning again. Through this channel or another, the CIA, by the way, by extension I would say the intelligence community, because the CIA is gets only 15% of our intelligence budget. We have numerous intelligence agencies, and many researchers automatically and incorrectly equate the CIA with the U.S. intelligence community. Again, there's the NSA, the DIA, ONI, OSI, and plenty of others. Beginning again. So I think perhaps in most texts, including this one should perhaps substitute intelligence community for, or U.S. intelligence community for CIA, or perhaps even a faction of U.S. intelligence, because it's highly factionalized. Beginning again. Through this channel or another, the CIA or a saboteur may have delivered a single roller bottle containing AIDS viruses to experimental vaccine producers or directly to Merck's hepatitis B and perhaps other multi-component vaccines, the vaccines that appear to have played a principal role in infecting scores of human subjects in the early 1970s in New York City, Central Africa, and other regions of the world hardest hit by AIDS. Also, considering Merck, Sharp, and Dome's relationship with the military, and its economic competitor, the Institut Pasteur Production, in contrast to previous theories on the initial international spread of AIDS from Central Africa through needle sticks or homosexual practices, covert operations by the CIA, contaminated vaccines, and even industrial espionage, may explain the rapid progress of the epidemic to African, European, South American, and Eastern nations. Given the Cold War climate in the 1970s, the believed strategic importance of Central Africa, and the activities to promote military and economic dependence of several black nations, in particular the resource-wealthy regions of Angola and Zaire, the use of HIV and Ebola as biological weapons to affect military, economic, and, quote, national security, unquote, objectives, including population control, must be considered. This theory is bolstered by the following facts. As National Security Advisor under Nixon in 1969, Henry Kissinger ordered a reassessment of America's biological weapons capabilities, from which the option to develop immune system-destroying viruses was selected. Such viruses were to be used when necessary to keep U.S. military, quote, visibility to a minimum, unquote, during a, quote, gray, unquote, area operation intended to influence, quote, certain events of potentially global importance, unquote. Shortly following their development, Kissinger also ordered the CIA, whose scientists developed and stockpiled numerous deadly viruses for Project MK Naomi, to conduct covert military operations in the Zaire-Angola arena, the region of Africa hardest hit by the AIDS and Ebola epidemics. The Defense Department and NCI paid Litton Bionetics, as supervised by Dr. Robert Gallo at the NCI and other affiliated biological weapons contractors, millions of dollars during the 1960s and early 1970s to produce immune system depleting and cancer-causing viruses. These would include the viruses with the pathological effects of the HIVs and the hemorrhagic fever viruses Ebola and Marburg. U.S. congressional documents confirm the CIA obtained dozens of biological weapons, including deadly viruses, and illegally maintained them in storage facilities on the grounds of Fort Detrick as late as 1975. Thereafter, they possibly retained private firms for such purposes, despite all such actions being illegal. CIA chiefs acknowledged their likely use of biological weapons through covert operations long after the ratification of the Geneva Accord by Kissinger and Nixon, despite knowledge that all such actions were illegal. The CIA conducted dozens of biological warfare experiments on hundreds of thousands of unsuspecting human subjects, both domestically and in foreign lands. DoD biological weapons contractors Merck and/or Litton Bionetics conducted numerous AIDS-like virus and vaccine experiments during the 1960s and early 1970s, simultaneously in New York City and/or Central Africa, the two areas hardest hit by the AIDS epidemic. Population control was deemed a high-priority foreign policy and national security objective during the late 1960s and early 1970s by the then Honorable George Bush of Texas. More recently, groups active in the Council on Foreign Relations have urged policymakers and industrialists to reduce even the size of the U.S. population to between 125 and 150 million people, quote, or about its size in the 1940s, unquote. The fact that the epidemic overwhelmingly and specifically struck groups that had been consistently targeted by American intelligence agencies does not necessarily give more weight to the intentional transmission theory, since MSD and other military vaccine producers routinely used black Africans, prisoners, and other high-risk groups for vaccine experiments. The author then goes on, Leonard Horowitz then goes on to describe the accidental alternative. By the way, he is of the impression from conversations that it was deliberately introduced into populations. It is highly plausible that the earliest AIDS, but he also presents another possibility which he holds open. It's one of the things I like about this book. It covers all of the bases, and it's lavishly documented from an historical standpoint and also from a scientific standpoint. And again, this book is like old home week for listeners to this program. He talks about the Galen Organization, the Project Paperclip scientists, the Rat Line, the Knights of Malta. It's quite a piece of work, and it's a very exciting and critically important book. Now, the next section here is called The Accidental Alternative. It is highly plausible that the earliest AIDS, Ebola, Marburg, and Reston viral outbreaks occurred accidentally. The most common source of these outbreaks was not African monkeys per se, but more specifically, African primates inoculated with such viruses and subsequently exported by Litton Bionetics for vaccine production, cancer studies, and biological weapons research. The weight of evidence then falls on Litton, the principal military, medical, industrial, quote, support services, unquote, provider to all NCI contractors, including MSD, the New York University Medical Center, Hazleton Laboratories Incorporated, Davis Laboratories, and others. Given the number of documented laboratory outbreaks alone in 1967, 1976, 1978, and 1989, all associated with specific monkey species supplied by Litton Bionetics or Litton monkey cohabitants, it is reasonable to conclude that an independent investigation of the records and quarantine facilities of Litton's foreign and domestic primate research and supply centers is in order. Another concern regarding vaccine production facilities and their products is the fact that government and industry standards disregarded simian virus contaminants. Contamination of experimental and production vaccines, including polio and others, by SV40, SFV, SIV, and possibly SIV in the range of 100 particles per dose occurred routinely and, very likely, given rise to viral recombinants that might have crossed species barriers, as in many cases they had been engineered to do through human tissue All told, such methods and materials used by NCI researchers could have easily created AIDS virus progenitors, including SIV, SIV-AGM, SIV-CPR, and HIV-2. Thus, the iatrogenic theory of HIV and HIV development is strongly supported. By the way, that's IATROGENIC. That word is a new one to me. Continuing. With the North American AIDS epidemic, besides the NCI and Litton Bionetics, the Merck Company and the NYUMC appear chiefly accountable. With the North American AIDS epidemic, besides the NCI and Litton Bionetics, the Merck Company and the New York University Medical Center appear chiefly accountable. It is reasonable to propose HIV-1, HIV-2, or other progenitors initially infecting Litton-supplied monkeys were accidentally transmitted to MSD or NYUMC experimental vaccines that were then tested on mentally retarded children, gay volunteers, and others in New York City as early as 1970. Though polio vaccines are also suspected of transmitting HIV-1 and other viruses, the unique epidemiology and concurrent outbreaks of AIDS in New York City and Central Africa appears to coincide more closely with the administration of experimental hepatitis B vaccines than with either the Salk or Sabin vaccines. The polio vaccine trials were conducted during the mid to late 1950s and early 1960s. Had HIV-1 been transmitted then, the outbreaks would have been more likely to have occurred during the late 1960s or early 1970s, that is, almost a decade before the onset of clinical cases and prior to when molecular genetics indicates HIV-1 evolved. However, the possibility that HIV-1 evolved in Willowbrook children and or gay men as a result of first polio and then hepatitis vaccine contamination cannot be ruled out. By the way, Willowbrook is an institution in New York for retarded children and appears to have been used either for experimentation or a tragic accident. Continuing. The first 4 lots of Merck's experimental hepatitis B vaccine may have been partially derived from the children and or the men's blood serum, which may have included live SV40, SFV, SIV, AGM, or other viruses, potential building blocks of HIV-1, transmitted to the human donors during polio vaccination a decade earlier. Thus, recombination of HIV-1 ancestors may have occurred in one or more of the hepatitis B serum donors. This, as an alternative to purposeful or chimpanzee-mediated contamination of the Merck vaccine, could have resulted in the transmission of AIDS as well. Another polio vaccine theory accepted by Dr. Howard B. Ernovitz, founder and chief science officer for Calypte, C-A-L-Y-P-T-E biomedical company in Berkeley, California, is also noteworthy. Ernovitz concluded that HIV-1 may be a monkey-human hybrid since a certain number of the polio vaccine recipients possibly maintained the HIV-1 envelope in their cells as a normal gene. This gene then could have recombined with any of the viruses likely to have contaminated the human vaccines in question to produce a monkey-human hybrid on the way to becoming HIV-1. Like Martin, Kyle, Schultz, Ellswood, and Stricker, Ernovitz called for careful PCR analyses of the experimental vaccine lots in question in order to prove or disprove these hypotheses, providing the lots allegedly in safekeeping at the FDA have not been altered or destroyed. By the way, in this context, I also recommend the remarkable book Mary, Fairy, and the Monkey Virus by Ed Haslam. That's put out in softcover by the Wordsworth Press. You can have your bookstore order that from an 800 number. That is called that 800 number is 800 Monkey X. Once again, that 800 number from which you can order the Ed Haslam book, 800 Monkey X. Again, Wordsworth Publishers out of New Mexico, a very, very important book. Also, I did a 3-hour interview in half-hour segments with author Ed Haslam. That is available from Spitfire. I'll give the address at the end of the program. This next segment that I'm going to read here is entitled Plausible Denial and Self-Incrimination. Unless the U.S. Congress orders an independent investigation, thorough genetic analyses of the suspected hepatitis B and polio vaccine lots, and look-back studies of disease among their recipients, the origin of the AIDS mystery will likely remain unsolved. Given all the facts, however, there is one thing for certain. The speculation that AIDS jumped species naturally to initially infect people virtually simultaneously on 2 far-removed continents and More oddly, in the two exact regions wherein the suspected AIDS-like virus and vaccine experiments took place must be seriously questioned. Moreover, based on the massive evidence compiled herein, scientists, including those at the NCI and CDC who advocated such far-fetched notions of the origin of AIDS in contrast to their knowledge of the NCI's Special Virus Cancer Program and recombinant viral vaccine experiments, have obviously incriminated themselves. Such self-incrimination is additionally evident considering the same core group of research institutions and researchers falsely alleged. Such self-incrimination is additionally evident considering the same core group of research institutions and researchers falsely alleged, 1, that HIV was widely distributed in Central Africa in the early 1970s and even long before. 2, that the Marburg agent was likewise found in monkeys throughout the world. 3, that Merck's hepatitis B vaccine was vindicated as the source of HIV transmissions. 4, that American researchers required the French to discover how to keep HIV-infected T cells alive. 5, that key researchers, including Don Francis and Luc Montagnier, were unaware of Robert Gallo's AIDS-like virus experiments during the early 1970s. 6, that funding would not be withheld during the early 1980s to allow other researchers to investigate the virus suspected of causing AIDS. 7, that the AIDS virus took several years to discover. 8, that the discovery of HIV, or HTLV-3-LAV, took place during the 1980s simultaneously by Gallo and Montagnier. 9, that the discovery of HIV-2 occurred virtually simultaneously by Essex and Montagnier. 10, that the subsequent French-American AIDS fracases evolved so inexplicably. 11, that the Ebola viruses represented a serious natural threat to humans, despite evidence and expert testimony that it was man-made. And 12, that HIV-1 cannot be the cause of AIDS, as argued by Peter Duesberg. Finally, that virtually no attention was paid by any of the suspects to the iatrogenic theory of AIDS is additionally suspicious, if not criminal. And again, I'm going to read some more from the book, but if listeners have their interest piqued, I strongly recommend that they get a hold of the book. I'm going to give more information about how to get a hold of it later. Now, again, this book will be like old home week for veteran listeners to this particular program. There is extensive discussion of the Galen Organization, the Knights of Malta, and in particular the Project Paperclip scientists, the Nazi scientists who were brought into the United States at the end of World War II to work in various defense industries. And indeed, the author has developed hard evidence of a continuity, an institutional continuity between many of the institutions that utilized some of these Nazi scientists and some of the institutions that crop up in connection with the probable development of AIDS, Ebola, etc. This next segment that I'm going to read is entitled Nazis in the Navy and Viruses from the Sky. After a discussion of the Project Paperclip scientists brought into the United States, the author says, besides the involvement of Nazis in bacteriological weapons experiments conducted by the Air Force, General Bolling's JIOA imported several BW experts into the United States for the Navy as well. Eric Traub, E-R-I-C-H, capital T-R-A-U-B, for instance, quote, in charge of biological warfare for the Reich Research Institute on the secluded island of Rhin, where his biological warfare research specialty was viral and bacteriological diseases, unquote, and his assistant, Anna Burger, A-N-N-E-B-U-R-G-E-R, went to work for the Navy in 1951 under Project Paperclip. Assigned to the Naval Medical Research Institute laboratory in Bethesda, their work, quote, included conducting experiments on animals to determine the lethal doses of more than 40 strains of highly infectious viruses, unquote. Within 10 years, the Navy's Biomedical Research Laboratory, or NBRL, along with Litton Bionetics, had become a chief supplier of, quote, cell cultures for cancer research studies to NCI investigators, unquote, throughout the world. By the early 1960s, the NBRL became closely associated with the University of California. That's, by the way, the Naval Biomedical Research Laboratory. By the early 1960s, the NBRL became closely associated with the University of California, where Peter Duesberg was working on NCI projects. Naval studies directed by Dr. Mark A. Chatigny, or Chatigny, C-H-A-T-I-G-N-Y, and, quote, Biohazards Control and Containment Segment, unquote, Chief Dr. Alfred Hellman, also associated with the Atomic Energy Commission, sought to identify the effects of, quote, viral aerosols, unquote, on animals and humans. Their principal NCI grant objective was to, quote, evaluate the effect of selected stress situations on induction of viral disease or cancerous trauma, and to evaluate the role airborne particle size might play in such interactions, unquote. At the same time, another Navy study was underway to determine, quote, the fundamental biology of tumor cells and the interaction between tumor cells and viruses, unquote, that cause cancer. This study, begun October 1st, 1962, relied on the expertise of Dr. Walter Nelson Rees, that's Nelson hyphen capital REES, described by Strecker as the keeper of America's cell lines. The Navy University of California collaborative effort was officiated by the NCI's Solid Tumor Virus Segment Vice Chairman James T. Duff, DUFF, who along with Robert J. Huebner, HUEBNER, the segment's chairman, worked closely with Duesberg on his studies to determine the structure and regulating mechanisms of cancer viruses. Following this decade of progress, a 1971 National Cancer Institute report shown in Figure 18.2 summarized this study group's proposed course of action. Quote, continue to develop cell reagents as substratas for human carcinogenesis, attempt to isolate and characterize viral agents from human tumor cells, continue a reference laboratory of cells in culture, study oncogenic viral antigens during embryogenesis, development of the human embryo, and continue basic research in the biology of tumor viruses. Then the author goes on to write, Dr. Horowitz goes on to write, though by this time I had grown accustomed to shocking new evidence, I still balked on finding these documents linking Hitler's biological weapons chief to the National Cancer Institute's finest. The next segment of the book Emerging Viruses that I'm going to read concerns the involvement of Dr. Peter Duesberg. You've heard a couple of references to Dr. Duesberg. Dr. Duesberg maintains that HIV does not cause AIDS and that it's produced by the lifestyles of the people that have come down with it. I have been very skeptical about Peter Duesberg from the beginning, simply because the groups that are getting it, gays and blacks in Africa, have basically been doing what they've been doing for a long time, and they haven't gotten anything like AIDS. Beyond that, the implication that lifestyle has produced these diseases is sort of a scientific, or I believe pseudoscientific, rationalization, which is identical with the viewpoint of the extreme Christian right, that basically AIDS is the punishment visited by God on the sodomizers and the fornicators and the users of false drugs. Well, certainly the stronger one's immune system is and the fewer foreign invasive things one has in one's body, the stronger one's immune system will be. The fact of the matter is that gays have been doing what they've been doing for a long time. People in Africa have been doing what they've been doing for a long time. I've even heard Duesberg and Duesberg disciples suggest that people who smoke marijuana are going to get AIDS or have AIDS, and that's simply preposterous. And we should note, whatever the implication of this, that Peter Duesberg has been deeply involved with the milieu that is implicated in either the accidental or deliberate creation and or transmission of AIDS. And we should note that this milieu has evolved from and includes elements descending from Project Paperclip, the importation of Nazi scientists at the end of World War II, as we just read in the last segment. The last section that I'm going to read from this book, again, Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional, by Dr. Leonard Horowitz, a book that I'm going to be excerpting at considerable length for a long time to come. And again, I'm going to be interviewing the author on more than one occasion. This next segment concerns Dr. Peter Duesberg's work for the NCI and his association with people like Dr. Robert Gallo and his imputation of the lifestyles of people who have AIDS as being responsible for AIDS rather than HIV. Dr. Horowitz writes, in any case, Duesberg has argued for more than a decade that you can find HIV in any burned-out, drugged-out, and sexed-out individual. He has consistently, quote, blamed the victims, unquote, of AIDS for living unhealthy lives. His arguments are difficult to dispute since physicians and scientists have known for years that strong host resistance is a key factor in determining whether or not an infectious germ can take root, grow, and ultimately overwhelm the immune system. Moreover, he has claimed that HIV is very difficult to spread, which it is. With rare exception, it generally requires larger doses of viruses in more healthy individuals to claim lives. So nothing Duesberg has said is new. In fact, Duesberg's position is exactly that held by prominent NCI and NIH researchers from the beginning of the epidemic. As Schultz wrote, that's Randy Schultz, it is, quote, incredulous, unquote, that the National Cancer Institute in 1982 was still fiddling around with half-baked theories that GRID was caused by poppers or sperm. But those were the presentations the NIH researchers made at the conferences. None of them was talking about what Francis thought was the most obvious cause, a new viral agent, unquote. The fact is that Duesberg, like Gallo, Montagnier, Francis, Hilleman, and a few others, had been part of a core group of investigators funded by the NCI to study, quote, special, unquote, viruses and their links to cancer. In 1971, for instance, Duesberg became a, quote, project director, unquote, for the University of California's contract NIH 71-2173 to study the mechanisms regulating mutant RNA tumor virus reproduction and sarcoma development. The RNA-dependent DNA polymerase-related effects Gallo and his team studied. This work followed sarcoma and leukemia virus studies on monkeys and cows, also conducted at the University of California with NCI funding. The same year, during a meeting in Paris attended by Gallo and Montagnier, Duesberg presented evidence that RNA leukemia and sarcoma viruses can be manipulated and observed to produce the, quote, provirus DNA, unquote, needed to successfully reproduce in nature and cell cultures. Earlier, Duesberg evaluated the effects of chemotherapy using the antibiotic actinomycin D on mouse leukemia viruses, or MLV. Later, he examined leukemia and sarcoma viruses to show how mutants of varying oncogeny are formed. Most pertinent to Duesberg's main argument, HTLV-3 does not cause the immune deficiency in cancers seen in AIDS. Duesberg and Gallo in 1973 debated essentially the same question. Can, quote, special, unquote, type cRNA tumor viruses, such as those captured from simian monkeys and modified for human experiments, cause cancers? Duesberg answered affirmatively, quote, that is absolutely right. This last paragraph again, because it's really critical for those who want to develop an intelligent, critical evaluation of Duesberg's work. By the way, his book was, I believe, published by Regnery Publishers. That's an ultra-right-wing publisher. I should say right-wing publisher. Some of the stuff's ultra-right-wing, but it's a right-wing publisher. Most pertinent to Duesberg's main argument, HTLV-3 does not cause the immune deficiency and cancer seen in AIDS. Duesberg and Gallo in 1973 debated essentially the same question. Can, quote, special, unquote, type cRNA tumor viruses, such as those captured from simian monkeys and modified for human experiments, cause cancers? Duesberg answered affirmatively, quote, that is absolutely right, unquote. The discussion occurred following Gallo's presentation, quote, on the origin of human acute myeloblastic leukemia, the virus hotspot hypothesis, unquote. Gallo was joined by Dr. Wu, W.U., who presented two related papers as an emissary of Lytton Bionetics. During the session's open discussion, Gallo questioned whether the genetic, quote, hotspot, unquote, that caused cells to become cancerous was responding to an internal or external virus-like particle. And I'm going to quote the exact debate here, verbatim, as presented by the author. Again, as was the case with the Dr. Nicholson paper, this is essentially Greek to me, but the author presents a summary and analysis of what is said here, and it's very important. Gallo, are there viral type C RNA tumor virus genes in some normal cells? Everyone by now must believe that there are some viro genes in at least some normal cells. I would like to know where they came from, or which came first. Are these viro genes in fact really cell genes which the virus utilizes? Duesberg should speculate on this. Duesberg, that's too much for me. That's like all theories on the origin of life. Where do whales come from? Where does God come from? Where does a clean chicken come from? But I would like to return a question to you, maybe somewhat related to that. I think we can at least divide those viruses which cause cancer and those which are subvirus-like things which may be a consequence of cancer. I think that those which are causing cancer may be like the men and the other more or less like the boys. So I think that shouldn't be confused too much. I think these subviral particles or endogenous viruses or incomplete endogenous viruses or enzymes might in fact well be a consequence of cancer rather than its cause. But I think there is little doubt that RUS, R-O-U-S-S-V, mouse sarcoma virus, or AMV bird virus can be the cause of cancer, unquote. Gallo. I kind of agree with that. At least they cause chicken cancer. I think the information for carcinogenesis may be packaged into only very special type C RNA tumor viruses. But I wouldn't even make those viruses that you call boys any less important because boys can become men. Moreover, we have now demonstrated that the reverse transcriptase in human leukemic cells and the viral-related nucleic acid is related not to endogenous non-oncogenic type C viruses, but specifically to type C viruses which in fact are oncogenic, such as the woolly monkey simian sarcoma virus. Duisberg. That is absolutely right. And the author adds in parentheses, emphasis added. Now, Dr. Horowitz goes on to basically interpret this for the lay people, of whom I am most assuredly one. In essence, Gallo stated and Duisberg acknowledged that only, quote, very special, unquote, retroviruses could be expected to produce AIDS-like symptoms, as this had already been proven in monkeys and other animals. In contrast, since the publication of his objections to the HIV = A = AIDS paradigm in 1988, Duisberg has been diverting public attention from the facts by arguing that HIV has nothing to do with AIDS. AIDS-like viruses do cause immune system disorders and cancer, he admitted, at least in chickens and monkeys, before they were clearly modified to infect human cells. In light of Duisberg's documented ties to the NAS and NCI, at the exact time that the NAS informed the DoD that AIDS-like viruses could be developed in 5 years for $10 million, I wondered whether the professor intended to provide a disinformation smokescreen for these organizations. And I have no answer to the question provided by Dr. Horowitz here, but it certainly is interesting. Again, this last couple of segments. In essence, Gallo stated, and Duisberg acknowledged that only, quote, very special, unquote, retroviruses could be expected to produce AIDS-like symptoms, as this had already been proven in monkeys and other animals. In contrast, since the publication of his objections to the HIV = AIDS paradigm in 1988, Duisberg has been diverting public attention from the facts by arguing that HIV has nothing to do with AIDS. AIDS-like viruses do cause immune system disorders and cancer, he admitted, at least in chickens and monkeys before they were clearly modified to infect human cells. In light of Duisberg's documented ties to the NAS and NCI, at the exact time that the NAS informed the DoD that AIDS-like viruses could be developed in 5 years for $10 million, I wondered whether the professor intended to provide a disinformation smokescreen for these organizations. DoD, of course, is the Department of Defense, i.e., the Pentagon. I would also note that some critics of Duisberg have speculated about the possibility of Duisberg and or his colleagues attempting to convince high-risk groups that there was nothing wrong, that they should go ahead and not amend their behaviors, and that this would ultimately result in more AIDS. And again, I have no answer to that speculation. That line of speculation has been introduced, however, in at least one weekly magazine in Southern California. Now, the last item that I'm going to present as part of the prepared portion of this program is an excerpt of a letter from the author of this book, Dr. Leonard Horowitz, to Dr. Robert Gallo, the preeminent retrovirologist in this country. This is a letter from Dr. Horowitz to Dr. Gallo dated August 2nd, 1996, and I'm just going to excerpt a small part of it in the interests of time. I'm going to quote Dr. Gallo's reply to a previous question that had been proposed by Dr. Leonard Horowitz. Horowitz writes, in keeping with my agreement to send you in advance any quote I plan to use in forthcoming publications for you to verify its meaning or intent, I relay the following segment. Though many researchers, including Dr. Gallo, claim that the technology did not exist to create HIV at that time in one of their laboratories, and that the human AIDS virus could not have been developed by simply combining cat, chicken, cow, and monkey cancer viruses, they admit that the, quote, missing link, unquote, between the SIVs and the HIVs is perplexing. Skipping down after dissing the notion that some of those viruses could have been recombinant, he then basically goes on to backtrack. I might as well read the whole thing here, just in the interests of veracity. This again is part of Dr. Gallo's reply. Regarding the cat, chicken, monkey, or cow virus recombination theory, quote, it's altogether an impossibility, unquote, Gallo defended, again quoting, I would tell you if something like that went wrong. I can think of more rational and possible things that could have happened by accident at that period of time, but that's really the wrong tree, unquote. And then this is the really significant part here. It's not easy to follow the verbiage, but basically this is what Dr. Horowitz, this is why Dr. Horowitz wanted me to read this. And this again is from Dr. Robert Gallo, the preeminent AIDS researcher. However, when I asked the world's most eminent retrovirologist, quote, so there's absolutely no possibility that these types of experiments, not necessarily in your lab, presented building blocks where hybrids were being created that might have given rise to the HIVs, Dr. Gallo replied, quote, no, I cannot say no to you. I don't say no to you. I said that we don't have any virus that we know of that has homology to HIV-1. To say this became HIV-1 except for the monkey virus SIV or the human virus HIV-2, which is exactly the same as the strain of SIV. We just don't have any virus that has those sequences in it, unquote. Gallo continued, quote, now if you then say to me, could it be an unidentified virus that mixed A with B with C? Then I would say, yeah, that's possible, unquote. And Horowitz then goes on to say, please let me know if this still accurately reflects your scientific knowledge and opinion, or if you would like to add or delete anything. Basically, it's not easy to follow, but what Dr. Gallo, again, the preeminent AIDS researcher, certainly the most famous AIDS researcher, is saying here, he is admitting the possibility of an accidental man-made creation of AIDS, or that AIDS might have been accidentally developed in a lab. Although this is certainly far short of the speculations and the evidence presented by many people, it is nonetheless, I think, very significant to have Dr. Gallo admit, and that's what he just did, of the possibility of AIDS being created by humans. And it was not a naturally occurring virus, but a created virus, albeit, in this case, he's saying an accidentally created virus. And again, permission to read this was explicitly granted to me by Dr. Leonard Horowitz. Once again, we're running real low on time here. I want to repeat the information about where you can get, or where your bookstores can order and or stock the book Emerging Viruses, AIDS and Ebola, Nature, Accident, or Intentional, published in hardcover by Tetrahedron and authored by Dr. Leonard G. Horowitz. There's an 800 number that can be called 800-336-9266. Once again, that's 800-336-9266. And there's also, you can have them write to P.O. Box 402, Rockport, Massachusetts, 01966. Also, Tetra, there's an email address, tetra@tetrahedron.org. There is a website, by the way, the email address again, tetra@tetrahedron.org. The website is http://www.tetrahedron.org. Tetrahedron again, Tetrahedron. That 800 number, one last time, 800-336-9266. That concludes this hour excerpting of a One Step Beyond show from August 18th of 1996. My name is Dave Emory. Thanks for listening.